There's also a pretty good README. I'm happy with it so far, where it does outline everything from what you need to do to clone the repo and do a replace, because you probably don't want your project called Flutter skeleton. And then stuff with generating, and there's actually a make file too, so you don't have to remember all these complicated things. It's just like make gen, and it will do that. It'll generate everything. Or gen watch, make gen watch will do the same thing, but also be watching for further changes. Gen SEO, which that's conversation for later. So README's there, and I think if you're at least a somewhat competent developer, I bet you can get this up and running. The only caveat would be having a pretty simple REST API to connect this with if you need to go deep and actually be developing. But that stuff can also be ripped out. In fact, I started making a clean version of this where I started with this project, and because of the way everything is broken up into features, you'll see here feature, there's like feature for auth. I was basically able to just kind of remove auth and do a couple little changes that were required auth, and make this thing work without an API, because there's still a lot of value in here even if you don't want an API. Okay, so that's kind of like our app.dart. So let's look a little bit at the project structure here. So essentially within in lib, there's generated this folder. I don't think this folder is not even version controlled, or is it? I forget. There's a git keep, so I think it's meant to keep something. Anyways, you can mostly ignore that because that will get generated. And then these are where your like ARB files are for internationalization. But mainly everything's in source. So source is config, and this is stuff like our constants, as well as some SEO stuff. Core, so this is like stuff to do with the app, or like our base components, or like just components that kind of can be used throughout the app, aren't necessarily restricted to a certain feature. Things like dialogues, drawers, models that aren't feature specific. Make this a little bigger. And then, I'll skip that for now, but utils, these are things like debuggers, toasts, validation, and then our main apps in there, and our main.dart's right there. So within feature, this is kind of where each feature is, and I like this pattern, keeps everything very compartmentalized, and allows you to, use this skeleton and add more things without trouble, or create, or remove things even. So we'll look at a simple one. Auth's a little more complicated because there's a lot of things going on. Let me think what home's really simple. Let's look at user because this is a pretty standard. Likely you would have an API endpoint or set of endpoints for your user, and that could be things like getting your profile, or getting another user's profile, or getting a list of users. So essentially, this is kind of the pattern that I'm using here. Components. So these are like UI components. So things like what the profile looks like. And in this case, all a profile is in this app is a text box with the person's name. That's fine. But also, like, you might have a user card, you might have a user list, all those kinds of things. We have models. So this is where we get into doing some generated stuff as well. So essentially you make user.dart and you annotate it with freezed, and you just have to make sure it's part of these two files that won't even exist until you actually make this and run the generator. But it's cool because you extend this thing that doesn't even exist at first until you generate stuff. And you create a factory saying like, okay, there's always going to be an ID, there's always going to be a username. Sometimes there'll be a string called email, which makes sense because your own profile, you'll probably get your email back, but you're not going to necessarily get other users' emails back. And something I really like is, and this is using the JSON serializable package, we can annotate with JSON key. And basically, this is the name on the server. But this is how I want to refer to it in my code. I don't want to do this underscore naming. That's not the Flutter way, but it is the API way, and so forth. So it allows you to do that as well as set default values. And you can look up all the docs there's a lot more power to it. But this whole thing, if I was to actually write this out just as a standard class without using freeze, it would be maybe like twice as long if you do it properly. Nothing crazy, but it gets that like exponentially gets bigger as you have more and more, more and more fields. This is a pretty basic user. You can imagine when you have bio and images and who last login and stuff. It's a lot of boilerplate because you have to write this, but then you also have to create the from JSON method. Here, it just auto generates it based on these, how you've set up the schema. So this is like first time using this on I guess a real project. Not that this is real yet, but I really like it. And that's basically models. So providers are anything that manage. So I kind of have providers and services, and the way I think about it is services are like external data, and providers are data within your state of your app. So we have one for instance, the user list provider, and this provides data to a user list and has all the pagination sort of stuff in it to like fetch a page, and it uses the user service, which the user service is basically things like for list, we go and we get this at our API /user, and go and map that to a bunch of users as a list within this sort of like paginated response. But there's also like a service or a service function for retrieving as well as getting me. And you'd basically have, a different function feature here for each different API endpoint you need to work with. So the provider, though, yeah, it works with the service, but it essentially goes and gets that data. Okay, I want to hit that user list with this particular page, and this is just something with using the the paginated list view. You either need to like append the last page, so it knows not to have the listener anymore to get more, or just append page. And essentially, we set state. So state is, in this case, a list of users. So anytime we set state, because this is extending state notifier, which is part of Riverpod, this is similar to a provider of saying like, notify listeners. But this, anytime you change state, it will notify the listeners, and go, and everything's great. And then we expose it by making this thing called user list provider, which is a state notifier provider of this is the name of the provider, and this is essentially the data that the provider is watching / working with. And then we pass this guy in, and that's just basic Riverpod stuff. So those are like providers. There's also detail provider, which is very basic. This one allows us, it's using what's called a family, which allows you to essentially have different like instances of, because I might be getting a user detail for at a particular ID. It's not something that's going to be hard coded. It's always user one. No, I want to be able to pass it. So I can use, and just to show the implementation of this, let's see, in profiles, in this, we're essentially watching the user using the user detail provider, but passing in that ID that came back, that came from this parameter here, and that way we can then we have user and we can say user.fullname, and there's just some other really nice Riverpod fun. You can basically kind of be like, okay, because it is this one's this isn't a state notifier. This is a future provider. So it's going to have different states, right? It's going to be, oh, it's load, like when this first gets called, while that service is going on calling, you have a loading state, and that allows me to go like, okay, I just want to have, actually, sorry, let's look at a different example. This is just what builds the app bar. So when it's loading, it changes the names as profile, but once there is data, the app bar is going to say user.fullname, and if there's an error, it's going to say error. But similarly here, we can watch that, and when there is data, we essentially return the profile with that user through. If there's an error, we just do this empty placeholder of error, or if it's loading, we have an indicator. So that's future provider. Again, I'm not doing a tutorial on Riverpod right now. You can look it up, but I think it's a good overview of these two kinds of things. User of a future provider, as well as a state notifier. Okay, back over here. So we went through providers, and then screens. Screens is pretty straightforward. And my goal with this is like a screen is really just, and unless you trying to make it so that like for instance, profile screen, doesn't do much, right? Like ultimately it handles some stuff like error states, it does some stuff for the app bar, but ultimately it's really just calling this profile component. And that's like a pattern I'm trying to do a lot. So for instance, login screen, very basic. It's just login form, and this is where the UI is for, for the form. So trying to keep really everything. Screens is like, it's just kind of the container. There's no, I'm not going to put a column in there with a bunch of things unless it makes sense. And everything should just be, a component, even if it means having, a screen that just is calling a component. I just like the pattern. It's nice. Okay, so what I want to show now is you maybe noticed if you were really paying attention that let's look at, for instance, home. So home is so simple that I didn't break it up into these things, but it'd be very easy to move it, and VS Code helps a lot when you need to move things around. It will refactor your code for you. So I just have them like this. But I want to show you how this works. So this is the home screen. And no, it's not extending consumer widget. It's also not extending just your normal stateless widget. It's extending something called base screen. What is base screen? Well, it is something we've built, and it is the thing that extends consumer widget. And what's cool about it is this has a scaffold already wrapped in it. And does all these lovely things for you. So really in here, so instead of, normally we'd override build, right? But we're actually overriding body. And what body is, body by default, if you don't override it, you'll just get a container back, and that's kind of useless. But when you do override it, you'll see the body gets built within this thing. So we have the scaffold, the padding, and the child. You're able to, anytime you extend base screen, set some properties. So I could, in here, for instance, pass in include main drawer true, or, horizontal padding. There's a default of 8, but I could change that for that instance. But I can also override other things. So by default, there's no app bar, it just returns null. But in here, if I wanted to have an app bar, I just override app bar, and I return back what I want that app bar to be. So there's body, but there's also something called desktop body. And if I don't override it, it just does body. But I can override this to actually have a totally different layout for a desktop screen. So body is the one you have to do unless you just want a container back. But you can then decide, oh, I'm going to do desktop body and over here, and I could change, desktop body to put everything in a row, for instance. This same pattern also exists with components. So we have a base screen, but we also have a base component. Oops. No. Okay. Base component. That's weird. So base component, very, very similarly, although there's less stuff because there's no app bar in a component, but this is a little probably easier to take in. So the build function of this actually checks breakpoints.use mobile layout, which is a function we've made here. And all this does is media query of context. If the size.width is less than or equal to the breakpoint mobile, it'll return true, which means like, okay, if it's less, it's going to use body. If not, it does desktop body. So you don't even have to think about it. This higher level component essentially deals with that. So that's all nice and allows you to do cool things like I showed you before in, I think it's in the placeholder list. So placeholder list extends that base component, and there's a body and there's a desktop body. And all desktop body is doing, and this is just for demonstration purposes, instead of a column, it's doing a row for that content. And the content itself, this is just an internal thing, so we don't have to repeat this code in both things. And all it's doing is watching that placeholder provider, which is the thing that is remembering the state of this guy. So this is kind of cool. I can have all these guys and I can click them and delete, again, just for demonstrative purposes. But if I go back to the home page, you'll see it's still there because it's all relying on the same provider. And the placeholder provider, it's pretty basic. It's using that state notifier. Its type of data is list placeholder model. And anytime you add an item, it basically picks a random color and it takes whatever the state is, expand state or spread state, and then makes a new placeholder model. What is placeholder model? Well, all it is something with a color and ID that we're using here. There's also a remove function, which essentially just goes and looks for one with that ID and removes it. All right. The next thing I want to quickly look at that touches on a lot of those things is within Auth. This is where I have some actual forms, and we'll look at everything to do with login. So the login is pretty basic; it's just an email and a password. But I like the way we have done it here. So we'll start with the screen. We'll go to the login screen. So login screen, it's using base screen. I'm not overriding desktop body, so it's going to do the same. And basically I'm just making a size box so that it doesn't look huge, and it is taking in a component called login form. And this is where the UI is. And you'll notice in here, there's no functionality. Like there's barely, there's the odd thing that, I have to like say when you click the clear button, clear, or when you click the submit button, I want to submit. But other than that, everything is very decoupled from, so the UI is just like, this is just UI, and logic to do with like validation and everything is all handled elsewhere. And where's that handled? Let's look at the login form provider. And I'll open these side by side. So this is our UI for the login form, and we have a login form provider, and you'll see you can get that. That's just down here. So login form provider is a state notifier provider. We're passing in the login form provider, which is the provider itself, as well as the login form model. And login form model is essentially an email, password, and status. I can't use just like a string for this because we have multiple things in here, 2 strings and like a status of whether it's empty, dirty, processing, success, or error. And within here, we essentially create, so there are some text editing controllers, the email controller and password controller, and we initialize them here and add listeners. Every time they change, there's an update state, which essentially goes and changes replaces the state with whatever the email controller value is and the password controller value is. There's some getters just to get the email back easily within here if you need it. And then there's like a function called email validator. And this is, just the validator that you would normally do right in a form field. So validator, pass a function to return either null or a string. But keeping it here is nice. It's, separating our business logic. And all we do is say validator, email validator. We're passing a reference to the function, not actually executing the function. And then there's a submit. So what we do first is we update state. Oh, there's one little nuance I think I didn't go over here. Update state. No, because that's in a different thing. We say update the state just to say it's processing, because the UI is like, okay, if it's processing, we just don't want them to be able to click again. So when it's processing, the action is null. If not, it goes. And then what else we have here? So once we do that, we go and get the token. And this is just part of our auth service, which is very similar to the user service. But essentially, when you call login, you pass an email and password, and it goes up to our auth token endpoint and returns a token based on that response, or returns null if there's any kind of error. And essentially, if the token is not null, we have something called a session provider, and this is just everything to do with the current logged in user. So this has stuff like what their token is, who the user actually is, if they're authenticated or not, and if this is ready, because this is something that actually, when you first boot up the app, it waits until it's ready, so that you don't get this weird issue where you're like logged out and then logged in when it checks your token. So if it's not null, we set the token, and then we do this app router.push, and we actually pass in the name of the route. Now this is kind of cool because this route itself is actually part of our generated file, but it does come up in autocomplete, so you don't have to like worry too much. And if we actually look at the route, since we're talking about it, the app router, not the generated one, this is kind of how it works. So you essentially have a list of, these are just my main app routes, cool, which are like, okay, the login, or the home, the auth landing screen, which is kind of like when you choose to log in or not. And I'm passing in, the page and what it is. And then there's sort of this deep nested thing. You can have an auto route with children. And I just kind of like made it simpler by having this as its own constant, but this could easily be, injected right into here. But it's cool because you can, you basically do, okay, dashboard, but then you have children within that with their own, paths and whatnot, categories, users, all that kind of stuff. And that's all the stuff for routing. And then it generates all this, complicated code that you don't ever have to think about. So we just push to that thing, and we give them a toast saying, welcome back. And then we clear, and clear is basically just a function within here to set this back so that when you log out, because this provider is going to be in memory still, all these providers, unless you tell them to go away, they're going to stay in memory. So we have this clear so that when you log out and come back, it doesn't keep your username and password. So yeah, that's kind of like some nice separation there between we essentially have a screen, we have the login form component and the login form provider. And then there's also sort of an auth service that is in the mix of all this stuff within services. And this is the stuff for getting, logging in, registering, refreshing your auth token, which is something that can happen, checking if the email is available, checking if the username's available, those kinds of things. Yeah. So that's kind of a good overview. Now, the one other thing that I think is kind of cool is I've got, and this is still gonna be a work in progress to make better, but I have I think a pretty cool solution for SEO.